Garnet Creek, Wyoming Territory, the 9th of November, 1887. The sun that autumn had been a liar, a golden, generous liar that had whispered promises of a gentle season through every warm afternoon and every lingering dusk. For Marek Soka, the lie had already been exposed 3 weeks prior, when a timbering cable snapped in the high stand above the creek and sent a Douglas fir sideways into the man he had called his whole world. His wife, Iona, had buried him on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the lie of the sun gave way to the first honest frost, and by the 9th of November, the town of Garnet Creek delivered its own cold truth. The notice was not nailed to her door. It was slid beneath it, as though the man who delivered it could not bear to face the sound of his own knocking. Iona found it on the floor when she rose before dawn, a single sheet of company letterhead with the ink still faintly damp. She had to read it twice because the first time her eyes would not focus. Eviction. 48 hours. The company house was needed for the replacement man, a bachelor from Cheyenne who was already on the morning coach. She carried the paper to the window. Outside, the town was still dark, but she could see the shape of Alderman Croft crossing the square toward the livery stable, his lantern swinging in the pre-dawn murk. Croft was the mine superintendent, a broad-shouldered man with a beard like rusted wire, and a voice that carried the weight of unchallengeable authority. He had written the notice himself. She recognized his handwriting, the way he crossed his T's with a single sharp slash, like a man swinging a hatchet. She met him at the livery door. He was cinching a saddle and did not turn around. "Mr. Croft, I know why you're here, Mrs. Selker." He pulled the strap tight. The leather creaked. "And I am sorry about Marek. Truly. He was the best timberman I had. Then give me until the end of the month." He turned then, and his face was not unkind. That was the worst part. There was genuine discomfort in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been shame, but it was buried beneath the practical arithmetic of a man who managed 60 souls and a payroll that did not forgive sentiment. "The new man arrives Friday. He needs a roof. You understand that. I understand that my husband died making you rich, and you are putting me out before the ground has settled on his grave." Croft flinched. He set the saddle on the rail and looked at her directly for the first time. "There is a boarding house in Rawlins. I will pay your coach fare myself." "That is not nothing, Mrs. Selker." "It is close to nothing." He picked the saddle back up. 48 hours, he said, and his voice had gone flat, the way a door sounds when it closes for the last time. Iona Selker was an outsider twice over. She was a widow in a camp that measured women by the men who provided for them, and she was Polish, the daughter of a Silesian salt miner who had died the year before she crossed the Atlantic. Her accent rounded her vowels in ways that made the American wives smile at each other when she spoke. Her husband Marek had been Czech, close enough to her own tongue that they had built a private language between them, a pidgin of Polish endearments and Czech profanity that made them both laugh in the dark of their company bed. Marek had been a man who understood the earth, not the surface of it, the topsoil and the grass, but the deep architecture beneath. His father had mined salt in Wieliczka, where men carved entire cathedrals from white crystal hundreds of feet below the ground. Marek had grown up knowing that the earth was not dead weight, but a living system. That heat rose from below and cold pressed from above, and between the two there existed a zone of astonishing stability. He had tried to explain this to the men of Garnet Creek once over whiskey in the bunkhouse. "The surface is a fool, Iona," he would say, but he said it to the miners too. The surface freezes and bakes and cracks, go down 10 feet, and the temperature never changes. The earth remembers its own warmth. They had laughed at him. A man who whispered to rocks. The town watched Iona pack. They watched from behind curtain edges and half-closed shutters, the way people watch a funeral procession. They are not obligated to join. Mrs. Adler, the postmaster's wife, brought a loaf of bread and a jar of pickled beets and set them on the porch without knocking. Pity in Garnet Creek was a quick thing, a bird that landed and flew away before anyone could accuse it of lingering. No one offered a room, no one offered work. The mine was the only employer, and Croft's word was the architecture of their lives. Iona spent her last full day not packing but walking. She left the town and followed the creek south into the narrow canyon, where she and Marek had sometimes gone on Sundays, when the weather was kind and the work was done. It was a place of red rock walls and sparse juniper, and at its deepest point, where the canyon bent sharply east, there was a thing she had noticed months ago and mentioned to Marek, who had stopped walking and stared at it for a full minute without speaking. It was a fissure in the canyon wall, not a cave exactly, but a crack wide enough for a person to enter sideways, running back into the rock at a slight downward angle. Warm air drifted from it even in October, carrying the faint mineral smell of heated stone and wet calcium. Marek had put his hand against the rock face beside the opening and held it there. Geothermal, he had said almost to himself. There is hot water moving somewhere below this. Feel the rock, Iona, it is warm. Not the sun. The sun cannot reach here. This is from below. She had felt it. The stone was warm like a clay pot that had been sitting near a stove. Not hot, not dangerous. Simply and impossibly warm, while the November air above carried the first knives of winter. Somebody could live here, Marek had said, and then he had laughed because it was a theoretical observation, not a plan. He was a session etched in our world. He had a job and a house and a wife, and no reason to crawl into the earth. Iona stood before the fissure now. The warm air breathed against her face, carrying its mineral exhalation, the smell of calcium and sulfur and deep time. She turned sideways and pushed through. The passage was tight for 12 feet, the rock pressing against her chest and spine, forcing her to exhale to move forward. Then it opened. She stood in a space roughly the size of the company shack she was losing, perhaps 15 feet across and 8 feet high, with a ceiling of smooth, water-carved limestone that arched overhead like the inside of a kiln. The floor was dry stone, covered in a fine layer of calcium dust. The air was warm, not comfortable yet, not livable, but so dramatically different from the canyon outside that it felt like stepping from December into September. She put her palm flat against the back wall. It was warm. She could feel a faint vibration, the ghost of moving water somewhere deeper in the rock. Marek's voice came back to her, clear as a church bell. The earth remembers its own warmth. She went back to town and began to carry her things. It took her 3 trips. The iron stove was too heavy to move alone, so she left it, taking instead the stovepipe sections, which she could carry in a bundle on her back. She took the bedroll, the wooden chest with Marek's tools, the box of provisions, 2 canvas tarps, a coil of rope, and the one thing she had brought from Poland that she had never shown anyone in Garnet Creek, her father's salt mining journal, a leather-bound book filled with diagrams of ventilation shafts, thermal gradients, and the structural engineering of underground chambers that had stood for 600 years. The first night inside the fissure, she did not sleep so much as she survived in a state of suspended exhaustion. She lay on the bedroll on the stone floor, the canvas tarp pulled over her, and listened to the wind scream through the canyon outside like a thing in agony. Inside, the air was still. The temperature, she guessed, was perhaps 50 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, but warm enough that she was not shivering. The earth beneath her radiated a faint, steady heat that seeped through the bedroll and into her bones. She slept, and when she woke she began to build. The first week was ventilation. Her father's journal had an entire chapter on airflow in enclosed spaces, the way bad air pooled in low places and good air needed to be coaxed along deliberate paths. The fissures entrance was narrow, which was good for keeping wind out, but it also meant that smoke from any fire would fill the chamber in minutes. She needed a chimney. She found it on the third day. A narrow vertical crack in the ceiling at the far end of the chamber, partially blocked by calcium deposits. She spent 2 days chipping away at the deposits with Marek's rock hammer, widening the crack until she could feel a faint upward draft pulling at the flame of her candle. A natural chimney. The canyon wall above was fractured enough to allow the smoke to dissipate through a dozen tiny exits, invisible from below. The second week was the firebox. She could not build a large fire. The chamber was too enclosed, but she did not need a large fire. What she needed was thermal mass, a principle Marek had explained to her so many times it had become a kind of bedtime catechism. Eat a large body of stones slowly, and it will radiate that warmth for hours, even days, after the fire is gone. The stone is a bank. You deposit heat and withdraw it later. She built a firebox from flat stones stacked against the warmest wall, where the geothermal heat was already doing half the work. She lined it with clay dug from the creek bank outside, mixed with sand and dried over 3 days until it was hard as pottery. The firebox was small, no bigger than a bread oven, but behind it she stacked a wall of heavy stones, each one the size of a loaf, packed tight with clay mortar between them. When she lit a fire of dry juniper in the box, the heat had nowhere to go but into the stone wall behind it. The stones absorbed it. She could press her hand against the back of the wall an hour after the fire died and feel the warmth radiating outward, gentle and steady, like the breathing of a sleeping animal. By the end of November, she had a system. A small fire burned for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. The thermal mass wall, combined with the natural geothermal warmth of the deep rock, kept the chamber at a temperature she estimated was near 65 degrees. She slept in her bedroll on a raised platform of stacked stones covered in pine boughs, 3 feet off the floor, where the warmest air collected. She hung one of the canvas tarps across the entrance passage, creating a dead air buffer that stopped the cold canyon wind from reaching the main chamber. She ate sparingly, dried meat, hardtack, the pickled beets. Mrs. Raff Adler had left. She set snares in the canyon and caught 2 rabbits in the first week. She found a stand of wild rose hips along the creek, frozen but still edible, and she chewed them for the tartness and the vitamin she did not know by name, but whose absence she understood instinctively. She was alone. The work filled her days and the silence filled her nights. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt only the grim, methodical focus of a woman who had decided, in the most fundamental way possible, not to die. Word reached Garnet Creek that she was alive. A freighter hauling coal to the mine saw a thin line of smoke rising from the canyon and followed it, expecting to find a trapper's camp. Instead, he found Iona Selka carrying water from the creek in a tin bucket, her hair tied back, her hands red and cracked, her face thinner than he remembered. He told the story in the bunkhouse that night, and the men laughed. "She is living in a crack in the rock," the freighter said, shaking his head. "Like a lizard." "She will be dead by January," said one of the miners. Alderman Croft heard the story and said nothing. He sat in his office and looked at the wall and thought about the coach fare to Rawlins he had offered, still sitting in an envelope in his desk drawer. He opened the drawer and looked at it. Then he closed the drawer. There was a part of Croft that understood, in a way he could not articulate and would never admit, that the money in that envelope was not generosity. It was the price of not thinking about what he had done. He left it in the drawer, December came like a judge, not a blizzard at first, but a slow, grinding cold that settled over the territory like a stone lid being placed on a coffin. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30. The creek froze solid, the mine closed because the hoisting cables became brittle and snapped. Garnet Creek turned inward, every household burning through its woodpile at a rate that made even the well-prepared do anxious arithmetic. Silas Hargrove, who had built half the cabins in town and considered himself the authority on winter construction, watched his own north wall develop a rime of frost on the inside surface. He stuffed rags into the gaps between the logs and burned twice the wood he had budgeted for December. The heat fled upward through the roof and outward through the walls as fast as he could produce it. His cabin was a sieve. By the 20th of December, 3 families had combined into one household to share fuel. The temperature hit 38 below on Christmas Eve. A child in the Brennan cabin developed frostbite on her fingers while sleeping 6 feet from the fireplace. The wood was running out. The roads were impassable. And then the true blizzard came. It lasted 4 days. The wind was a living thing, a howling sentient force that found every crack, every gap, every poorly chinked joint in every cabin in Garnet Creek. Snow piled to the eaves. The world became a white void of screaming wind and killing coal. Inside the canyon, Iona heard it. She heard the wind roar over the rim above her, a sound like a freight train that never passed. But in her chamber the air was still. The thermal wall radiated its patient warmth. The geothermal heat from the deep rock held steady, indifferent to the apocalypse above. She fed her small fire twice a day and read her father's journal by candlelight and waited. She was warm. She was alive. Her hands were steady when she held her cup of boiled rosehip tea. When the blizzard broke on the 29th of December, Garnet Creek emerged like survivors of a shipwreck. 2 cabins had partially collapsed under the snow load. The Brennan girl had lost 2 fingers. Every household was nearly out of wood, and the next supply run was weeks away, if the roads could even be cleared. They were not freezing quickly, they were freezing slowly, which was worse because it allowed time for the fear to become a permanent resident. Alderman Croft was the one who came. He came alone, on snowshoes, following the frozen creek into the canyon. He told himself he was checking on company property, on the mining claims that ran along the south wall. He told himself it was an inspection, but the truth walked beside him like a second shadow. And the truth was that he had not slept in 3 nights and his office was 41 degrees, and he had burned his desk chair that morning for fuel. He found the fissure by the smell, wood smoke, but beneath it, something else. Something warm and mineral and alive. He squeezed through the entrance, pushing past the canvas tarp, and stepped into the main chamber. He stopped. It was warm. Not merely less cold, but warm, genuinely, impossibly warm, like the inside of a bakery on a winter morning. The air smelled of juniper smoke and heated stone and the faint sulfur of deep earth. Candles burned on small stone ledges. Iona sat on her raised sleeping platform, mending a rabbit-skin glove with a bone needle, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked up at him. She did not speak. Croft stood there, this man of authority, this man who had slid the eviction notice under her door because he could not bring himself to knock, and he felt the warmth of the earth pressing against him from every direction. His hands, which had been numbed for days, began to throb as the blood returned. His eyes burned, and he was not certain it was from the smoke. "How?" he said. It was not a question. It was a surrender. Iona set down the glove. She looked at him for a long time. She saw the frost in his beard, the dark hollows under his eyes, the way his shoulders had lost their administrative squareness and had become simply the shoulders of a cold and frightened man. "My husband told me the earth remembers its own warmth," she said. "You build your houses on the surface, The surface is a fool." Croft opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the stone walls, the clay-lined firebox, the stacked thermal mass wall still radiating heat from a fire that had died hours ago. He reached out and placed his bare palm against the rock. It was warm. He pulled his hand back as though he had touched something sacred and was not sure he had the right. "There are children in town, Mrs. Selker. The Brennan girl lost 2 fingers. I know. We are running out of wood. I know that, too." He looked at the floor. "I am not here to apologize," he said, and his voice was rough. "I am here because people will die if I do not find an answer, and I have no answer." Iona stood. She pulled on her coat and took a candle from the ledge. "Then I will show you what my husband knew," she said, "and what my father knew before him. And you will bring your people here until the roads are clear, and then you will learn to build differently." She did not say, "You owe me this." She did not say, "You put me out to die." She simply walked toward the entrance and waited for him to follow. He followed. Over the next 6 weeks, Iona Selker taught Garnet Creek how to survive. Croft organized work parties that packed earth and sod against the north walls of every cabin, creating insulating berms. Under Iona's direction, they built interior thermal mass walls, thick stacks of stone and clay positioned behind existing fireplaces, designed to absorb heat and release it slowly over 12, 14, 16 hours. They sealed their floors with clay and banked earth against their foundations. They reduced their fire sizes by half and found that half was more than enough when the heat had somewhere to live. Silas Hargrove was the last to adopt the method. He stood in his cabin with his arms crossed and watched Iona direct 2 miners and stacking stones behind his fireplace, and said that he had been building houses for 20 years and did not need a Polish woman to teach him how to keep warm. Iona said nothing. She finished the wall and left. 3 days later, Hargrove's cabin was warmer than it had been all winter on a quarter of the wood. He did not thank her, but he was seen, 2 weeks later, helping stack thermal mass stones in the Brennan cabin. And when someone asked him where he had learned the technique, he said, "From the rock," and did not elaborate. Spring came slowly to the canyon. The creek thawed. The roads opened. A supply wagon arrived in late March to find a town that was gaunt but alive. Every cabin modified in ways the driver did not understand. Earthen berms piled high, chimneys shorter and wider than he remembered. Iona Selker never moved back into a company house. She stayed in the canyon, expanding her chamber over the years, adding a second room and a proper stone-lined entrance. Travelers who passed through Garnet Creek in later years would sometimes hear about the woman who lived in the rock, and they would hike into the canyon expecting to find a hermit's hovel. Instead, they found a warm, dry, lamplit dwelling carved into the living stone, with a shelf of books and a leather journal open on a reading stand, and a woman who would offer them tea brewed from wild rose hips, and answer their questions in a quiet voice with an accent that softened her consonants like river water softening stone. Alderman Croft retired from the mine in 1893. On his last day in Garnet Creek, he walked into the canyon and stood at the entrance to Iona's home. He held out an envelope. Inside was the coach fare to Rawlins, the same bills, untouched for 6 years. "I should have knocked," he said. Iona took the envelope and set it on the ledge beside her candle. She handed him a cup of tea. They sat in the warmth of the earth and did not speak about the past, because the walls around them had already said everything there was to say. The lessons of Garnet Creek are not really about geothermal heat or thermal mass or the principles of underground insulation, though those things are real and they work, and they have saved lives in every century since humans first understood them. The lessons are about what we refuse to see because of who is showing it to us. You have someone in your life who has been telling you something true. You have not listened because they are too young, too foreign, too quiet, too far outside the circle of people you have decided are worth hearing. You have slid your notice under the door and walked away, and you have told yourself it was practicality, not cruelty. But the envelope is still in your drawer. What knowledge has been left to you that you have dismissed as impractical? What journal sits unopened? What lesson from a dead parent or a forgotten teacher have you filed away under things that do not apply to my real life? What crack in the rock face have you walked past 100 times without stopping to feel the warmth breathing from it? The blizzard is always coming. Your cabin walls are thinner than you think. And somewhere, in the deep structure of what you already know but have refused to use, there is warmth waiting for you. Your fissure is there. Your warmth is already rising. Start clearing the entrance. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival and shelter. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.